They paid for my brother's wedding, his honeymoon, even his house. For mine, nothing. I smiled, said nothing, and built a wedding they'd never forget. I remember the moment the florist flicked a stray petal off the aisle runner as clearly as a warning bell. It was a reflex, neatness before meaning, like everything my family did. The ballroom smelled like money trying to pass for innocence. Pale roses, beeswax candles, a string quartet rehearsing Pachelbel to iron out emotion into something polite. My mother floated from table to table, tapping the crystal with her knuckle to test its pitch, as if a note too dull might dent my brother's happiness. "Isn't it beautiful?" she whispered, not to me, but to the vision in her mind. She had been planning this wedding for a year and a half, speaking about it as if it were a child finally coming home. She wore her hair higher than usual, a silver comb, combative in the updo, like a quiet crown. I nodded and held my breath as staff threaded around us with towers of champagne. It was beautiful. That was never the question. My father stood near the entrance, checking his watch in a way that announced control. He had paid deposits in early winter, final bills in late spring, and tipped every vendor in thick white envelopes sealed with gold stickers. He liked the gestures of wealth that looked tidy on a ledger. When the photographer asked for the parents' portrait, he pulled my mother to his side with an arm that told a story. "This is ours. We built this. We are the kind of people who do things properly." My brother, Ethan, shone. He was good-looking in the way that reassures rather than startles. Classic suit, shoes polished to a soft mirror, expression arranged into the humble joy of a man gifted the exact life he expected. His fiancée, soon wife, was luminous and practiced. Everyone said she was perfect for him. I believed them. She had the talent of being liked without effort, and in our family, effort always showed like a wrinkle you'd failed to steam. I kept folding programs at a side table because someone had asked, and because my hands needed a job that wasn't clenching. Each cover read Ethan and Summer in ribboned letters. The ampersand looked like a loop you could fall into and never land. Aunt Lydia caught my arm. "When it's your turn, we'll do this all over again. You'll see." She meant to be kind. We both knew she might not live long enough to watch that prediction be shouldered aside. I smiled and said something harmless. I was good at harmless. Later, when guests arrived, the orchestra fattened, the air shifted, and money began to sparkle. Favors waited at every place setting, tiny bottles of imported olive oil with wax seals, as if the future could be preserved beneath it. My mother had argued with the caterer over the number of fig leaves in the centerpiece. My father had a special phrase for the maitre d', "Let's keep this elegant," which translated to, "Do exactly as my wife says," without appearing controlled by her. They were a team when showtime began. Toast after toast, the room turned soft around Ethan. People adored him, and their affection looked effortless. They told stories about chaos he had rescued them from. Flat tires, late-night calls, a dog retrieved from a shelter in a snowstorm, heroics that weighted the evening in his favor. I clapped so much my palms felt warm and useless. When the first dance started, my mother touched her throat, light as if steadying a necklace. She watched them sway under the chandelier with a relief that flashed close to something like victory. My father leaned toward her and murmured, "Worth every penny," and she tilted her head into his shoulder, letting the words land like permission. Anyone could have heard it and understood. Generosity as proof of love, all that money as a warm winter blanket. The thing about generosity, though, is how loud it is when it goes silent. People can pretend not to hear the silence, but they notice it anyway. They notice it like a draft at the back of the neck. I found myself by a window that framed the city as a promise. Buildings holding their breath, a river slipping like a secret. If you looked closely, you could see our reflection in the glass, ballroom behind, night ahead, and the two scenes layered like a future that wasn't invited to this one. Halfway through the evening, while the pastry chef wheeled out a cake the size of a small stubborn mountain, I remembered the first time my mother had said the sentence that had been crawling along the baseboards of my brain all night. "We'll see what we can do for yours." The year before last, calm voice, casual tilt of the head. I had asked if they wanted to set aside a budget like the one you're planning for Ethan. My mother had smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. My father, not looking up from his email, had added, "We're already stretching for your brother, honey. You're older, you'll figure it out." The math of love rewritten with a new variable. Stretch for him, self-solve for me. At the time, I'd swallowed it, told myself weddings weren't a measure, just an event. Told myself I was reasonable, independent, different. On nights when independence felt like an empty room, I wrote lists, things I could handle alone, things I could not bear to ask for. My parents' definitions of fairness lived in a column all their own. The band slid into a slower song, and my mother drifted toward me, eyes bright with triumph that passed for pride. "Isn't it everything?" she asked, and I said it was, because it was. "Someday soon," she added, patting my hand. "And when it is, keep it simple. Less stress, more meaning." She smiled as if she had given me a gift. I nodded again, to keep the air smooth around us. The truth was buzzing behind my teeth, insistent as a trapped bee. I kept my mouth shut and listened to the drumline of my own pulse. We had a family way of walking around painful facts as if they were sleeping dogs. It worked until it didn't. My name is Mara Ellison, and I was 31 years old on the night my brother married the future he had been raised to expect. I wore a navy dress chosen by my mother, flattering, not flashy, and the family diamonds hovered at my collarbone like small obedient stars. I made polite conversation with 12 tables of acquaintances. I signed a guest book that wasn't meant for me. If you had seen me then, you would have said I looked composed. I did. Composure had bought me entry into rooms I wasn't meant to occupy. It had also cost me the ability to ask for the same softness my brother received as a reflex. I had learned to fold myself into shapes that fit my family's furniture. Across the room, my father slipped another envelope to a vendor with a handshake that could have been mistaken for tenderness. It wasn't. It was just tidy. I thought of the day I would need to pay someone, not to make a night perfect, but to keep mine from being erased. "Come dance," Ethan called, grinning, gentle, with the confidence of a favored son. I loved him. That was also never the question. I loved him and understood him, and could not forgive the way our parents had become architects of our inequality, then insisted the house was symmetrical. I danced, I smiled. I kept time with the band and with the tick of a clock only I could hear, one counting down to a choice I hadn't named yet. The rhythm threaded through my bones, steady and patient, the way some storms take their time gathering on the other side of the horizon. The bouquet toss happened, a lace missile lobbed toward the cluster of women who pretended not to want it. The bouquet skimmed my shoulder and landed in the hands of a cousin who squealed as if the future had just chosen her by accident. My mother laughed, relief in the edges. "See," she said, "you hate that kind of attention anyway." I did not hate attention. I hated attention that came only when it served as decoration for someone else's story. By the time sparklers hissed in the night and the car pulled away, the ballroom had shed its glitter and returned to being a room with expensive lighting. Staff lifted centerpieces like trophies after the season. My parents thanked everyone as if they alone had made love possible. My brother kissed my cheek and told me he hoped my day would come soon, and that when it did, he'd be there. I believed him. I didn't believe the part where there meant the same thing for me as it had for him. When I finally stepped out into the cool air, the scent of roses gave way to the honest city. Metal, rain, something fried cooling on a late-night grill. I took off my heels and carried them like weapons I wasn't willing to surrender. The night felt cleaner than the ballroom had. My feet found the ground. I let the quiet wrap around me and for the first time let the surprise form. Not as a plan yet, but as a promise. I didn't know it then, but I had already started. When Ethan's wedding ended, life in my family seemed to slip back into its usual rhythm. Or so they believed. I went back to work, kept up with friends, and smiled at Sunday dinners, where my parents replayed stories from the reception as if the night had been canonized. Every anecdote ended with some variation of, "It was perfect," "worth every sacrifice." Sacrifice. That word sat heavy in me. Sacrifice meant choice. Sacrifice meant someone had decided he was worth the spending and I was worth the saving. I told myself I wouldn't keep score. For weeks, I repeated it like a prayer. But scorekeeping happens in silence, in the places no one bothers to look. Months later, when Daniel slipped the ring on my finger, a modest oval sapphire, chosen because he knew I cared for meaning more than spectacle, I couldn't help but think of that ballroom. My fiancé's hands were steady, his eyes soft with certainty. There was no orchestra, no roses, no crystal chandeliers. Just us, on the pier near the harbor, the water clapping against the pylons like applause no one else could hear. I was happy, purely, fully, deeply happy. Until the phone call. I called my mother that evening, voice trembling with excitement. I said yes, I told her. For a moment, she gasped with delight, and I almost believed she meant it. Then her tone shifted, careful, practical. "That's wonderful, Mara. We'll see what we can do to help. But you understand we're still paying off Ethan's wedding. Things are tight." Tight. A word that grated, knowing how thick the envelopes of cash had been, how generous the wine pours, how extravagant the open bar. "Of course," I replied. My voice sounded light, forgiving. Inside, something cracked. A week later, at Sunday dinner, the truth landed sharper. We sat around the long oak table, roast chicken steaming in the center. Ethan and Summer arrived late, laughing, radiant with the ease of people who knew their footing in the family was permanent. My mother ushered them in, kissed Summer's cheek, and asked about their honeymoon, their new apartment, their plans. And, my father added proudly, "We're helping them with the down payment. It's the least we can do." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. "The least?" I repeated quietly. "Of course," my mother said, eyes flicking to me as if I had broken some rule of civility. "Marriage is hard enough without financial strain. We want them to start strong." Her words slid into me like ice. financial strain. Start strong. I swallowed and lowered my fork, pressing the tines against my palm until it hurt. Congratulations, I told my brother, my tone smooth as glass. He beamed, oblivious. That night, Daniel asked me gently, "Did you expect them to help us?" "No," I lied, I didn't. But I had. Not the full spectacle, not the orchestra or the chandeliers, but something, a gesture, an envelope, a whisper of equality. What I received instead was advice. Keep it small, keep it simple. Advice dressed as wisdom, but in truth a dismissal. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My family didn't see me as the daughter worth investing in. They saw me as the one who could manage, the one who could go without. My brother needed support. I was expected to be support. In the weeks that followed, small comments cut sharper than they should have. My aunt asking if I'd just do a courthouse thing. My cousin saying she hoped I wouldn't be offended if she didn't buy a gift, since your parents probably won't either. My brother joking, maybe you and Daniel can just elope and put the money into something useful, like IKEA furniture. Each remark landed like a pebble in my chest, slowly building weight, until I couldn't draw breath without feeling it. That's when the silence began. I stopped asking questions. I stopped dropping hints. I smiled at their jokes, nodded at their advice, and quietly began to rewrite my own script. I told Daniel, "We'll plan it ourselves, but we won't tell them, not everything." "Why not?" he asked, though his eyes already held the answer. "Because," I said, my voice calm and colder than I meant. "Sometimes the best surprise isn't in what you give people, it's in what you don't let them take from you." And that was the first time the word surprise carried a new weight in my mouth. The planning should have been joyful. For most brides it was. Pinterest boards and bridal fairs, dress fittings and cake tastings. For me, every step carried a shadow. Every phone call from my mother became a reminder of what I wouldn't have. Every laugh from Ethan and Summer echoed with the things they had been given freely. It wasn't just the money, it was the attention, the reverence, the way my parents looked at them with a pride so heavy it bent the room toward them. One Saturday afternoon, I sat with my mother at her kitchen table. A stack of bridal magazines sat untouched between us. She flipped through her planner, jotting notes about Ethan's housewarming party. She hadn't even asked if Daniel and I needed help searching for a venue. "I've been thinking of something simple," I said carefully. "An outdoor space, maybe under string lights." She didn't look up. "Outdoor weddings can be risky. Besides, you don't need to go overboard. It's not about the wedding, it's about the marriage." The line was familiar, her polite dagger dressed in wisdom. I swallowed, nodded. "Maybe a small dinner afterward, just family," she continued. "Less stressful, more intimate. Translation, cheaper, easier, less memorable." I imagined telling her the truth, that I didn't want simple, I wanted significant. I wanted a moment that felt as sacred as the one she had curated for Ethan. Instead, I smiled, folded the corner of a magazine page, and said nothing. A week later, Ethan called me. "Summer and I are having another celebration," he said casually. "A 1-year anniversary party. Mom and Dad want to go all out again. Can you believe it?" Yes, I could. I believed it completely. "That's nice," I said, though the words tasted bitter. "Don't be jealous," he added, teasing the way older brothers sometimes do. "Yours will come together eventually." Eventually. As if mine was a backup plan, an afterthought. I laughed because silence would have been too sharp. When the call ended, I set my phone down and stared at the ceiling, the paint cracked in the corner from years of settling. I thought of how my parents would never allow a crack in Ethan's ceiling to show. They would fix it before it spread. The final blow came during dinner at my parents' house. Ethan and Summer arrived with news they were expecting their first child. The room erupted, cheers, hugs, tears. My father raised his glass, declaring that family was everything. And then my mother said it. Finally, a new generation to carry on the Ellison name. Finally, as if Daniel and I didn't exist, as if my life, my love, my future children, if I had them, were already marked as secondary. I sat there smiling, clapping, playing my part in the performance. But inside, something hardened. Not anger, not jealousy. Something colder, quieter. A resolve that whispered, they will never see me the way I see myself, but they will see what I can do. That night, lying beside Daniel, I finally spoke it aloud. They don't see me. He reached for my hand. I see you. His words warmed me, but the chill inside didn't melt. It sharpened. We'll plan this our way, I said. We'll save and we'll keep it secret. They think we'll settle for less. They think we'll shrink. Instead, I paused, the thought crystallizing in real time. Instead, we'll let them walk into something they never expected. Daniel studied me. What do you mean? I turned toward him, eyes steady. I mean, we won't correct their assumptions. We'll let them believe it'll be small, humble, forgettable, and then I let the silence hang like the opening of a trap. We'll give them a wedding they'll never recover from. He smiled, slow and certain, recognizing the steel in my voice. Then let's start. From that moment, the build-up wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. Every dismissive remark became fuel. Every overlooked detail became leverage. The more they ignored me, the sharper my vision became. At Sunday dinners, when my parents joked about Mara's little wedding, I nodded and played along. When Ethan smirked about eloping, I laughed with him. They thought they knew me. They thought they knew my limits. But silence, I learned, is not surrender. Silence is preparation, and I was preparing. The breaking point didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived in fragments, sharp, small, almost invisible. But they stacked up until the weight pressed so heavy it was impossible to ignore. It started at a family brunch. My mother stirred her coffee, her nails clicking against the porcelain, and said, "Darling, we've been talking, and we think you should really keep your wedding modest." Modest, my father repeated, as if the word itself was a blessing. Meaning, I asked, though I already knew. Well, my mother continued, a simple church ceremony, a little lunch after. You don't need anything grand. It's more meaningful that way, less fuss. Daniel sat beside me, his hand tightening on my knee under the table. I kept my voice even. Meaningful to who? To you, of course, my father said, sipping his coffee. Why waste money on one day when you could use it for something practical? Practical. The word landed like a nail hammered into my skin. Practical was the opposite of what Ethan had been handed. Practical was a ceiling cracked and ignored. Practical was a daughter who didn't deserve more. I excused myself, went to the bathroom, and stared into the mirror. My reflection looked calm, collected, polite, exactly how they preferred me. Inside, though, something else stared back. A woman who refused to be erased. The final shard came a week later. Ethan called. His voice carried that casual superiority I had grown used to. "You know, Mara, maybe Mom and Dad are right," he said. "Why stress yourself out? Just elope. Keep it small. No one will mind. Honestly, with your salary, it's probably all you can manage anyway." I froze. His words didn't sting because they were cruel. They stung because they were careless. He didn't even think twice before saying them. That was the worst part. When I hung up, Daniel found me sitting on the floor of our apartment, staring at nothing. "That's it," I whispered. My voice didn't shake. It was too steady, too sharp. "I'm done." "Done with what?" "Done asking, done waiting for them to see me. They've made it clear. I'm the child who has to shrink so Ethan can shine." I turned to him, my voice growing quieter, heavier. "But I won't shrink, not anymore." That night, as rain tapped against our window, I began sketching notes in a notebook, venue ideas, guest lists, budget breakdowns. But woven between the practical details was something deeper, a plan, not just for a wedding, for a reckoning. I would plan every detail without their input. I would let them believe in the illusion of small, modest, forgettable. And then, when the night came, I would hand them silence. Not anger, not confrontation, silence so loud it would ring in their ears long after the music stopped. This wasn't about revenge in the way people think of it. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about truth. A truth they had buried under favoritism and dismissal. A truth that said, "I am not the afterthought you take me for." The breaking point wasn't an explosion. It was the calm after the last insult. The cold clarity that nothing would change unless I forced it to. And so, in the quiet of our small apartment, with Daniel's hand covering mine, I began the real work. Not of planning a wedding, of planning a surprise. The days that followed felt sharper, more deliberate. Every choice I made carried double weight. One for my marriage and one for my reckoning. Daniel and I became conspirators, architects of a secret only we shared. We whispered over late-night dinners, passed notes in coffee shops, and carved our plans into silence while my parents continued believing in a small ceremony. And I let them. We started with the budget. My parents assumed we had none. What they didn't know was that Daniel and I had been saving quietly for years, small amounts tucked away with every paycheck. It wasn't enough for a ballroom and chandeliers, but it was enough for something else. Intimacy wrapped in elegance. We found it one rainy afternoon, an estate just outside the city, built in the 1800s, converted into a private event venue. Ivy crawled along the stone walls, windows glowed with golden light, and the gardens whispered of secrets. It wasn't enormous, but it didn't need to be. It was refined. Intentional. Ours. When we toured the grounds, Daniel squeezed my hand and whispered, "They'll never see this coming." And he was right. We kept our guest list small. Friends who had been family to us, mentors who had believed in me when my own parents hadn't, neighbors who had cheered us on. I sent vague invitations that read, "Please join us for an intimate evening." No details about location, no promises of grandeur, just enough to keep expectations modest. My parents assumed the worst. "Oh, a backyard dinner," my mother said one afternoon, chuckling as she folded laundry. "Well, that's very you, Mara, humble, sensible." I smiled, said nothing. Inside, I felt the slow curl of satisfaction. Planning became an act of quiet rebellion. For flowers, I chose deep burgundy dahlias and ivory roses, colors that whispered drama rather than screamed tradition. My mother adored pastel arrangements. I leaned into the opposite, knowing she'd never expect it. For music, we hired a small string quartet that played both classics and reimagined modern songs. I pictured my father's face when he recognized a melody he couldn't place, only to realize it was something contemporary disguised in elegance. For dinner, we found a caterer who specialized in seasonal menus. Courses designed like poetry, each plate a statement. No buffet tables, no clumsy trays, every detail intentional. And then there was the dress. I chose it alone. No mother at my side, no giggling entourage. Just me, a mirror, and the quiet hum of a boutique on a weekday morning. It was silk, simple but commanding, with sleeves that draped like whispered promises. I remember standing there, fingertips brushing the fabric, and thinking, "This is mine, all mine." I didn't cry, I didn't need to. What I felt was steadier than tears, power. All the while, my parents continued their script. At Sunday dinners, they made casual remarks. "Don't go into debt over one night." A potluck could be charming. "Ethan says eloping was almost an option for him and Summer. Maybe you should consider it." Each time I nodded, smiled, and tucked their words into the notebook where I had been keeping track of everything. Not because I needed the reminder, but because one day, when the surprise unfolded, I wanted to remember how certain they had been. The secrecy was intoxicating. On the night of our tasting session with the caterer, I told my parents Daniel and I were having a quiet dinner alone. When we signed contracts with the estate, I told them we were just window shopping. When I went for dress fittings, I told them I was meeting a friend for coffee. Every lie was small, almost harmless, but stitched together, they formed a tapestry of betrayal. Not theirs against me this time, but mine against the narrative they had written for me. As the date grew closer, the anticipation thickened. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the floor of our apartment, the final guest list between us. He looked at me, studying my expression. "How do you think they'll react?" I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. First, they'll be confused, then shocked, then quiet, and that's silence. That's what I'm after. "Not anger?" he asked. "No," I said softly. "Not anger, just silence. The kind that makes people realize they never knew you at all." By the time the invitations with the estate's address finally went out, it was too late for them to question. Too late for them to offer money, advice, or control. Too late for them to do anything but show up. I had built the stage. Now all that remained was to draw the curtain. And as I sealed the final envelope, my hands steady, my pulse even, I realized something. This wasn't just a wedding. This was my unveiling. The day arrived wrapped in ordinary weather. Gray skies, light breeze, the kind of afternoon you'd forget if not for what it carried. My parents woke that morning, assuming they were headed to a small dinner, maybe a courthouse ceremony first, perhaps a backyard toast afterward. They dressed for casual formality. My mother wore a pale blue suit she had recycled from Ethan's rehearsal dinner. My father wore the same tie he wore to Sunday brunches. I said nothing. The estate loomed at the end of a long gravel drive, ivy stretching across its stone walls, lanterns glowing along the path like a quiet welcome. Guests arrived in clusters, their chatter dipping into silence as they stepped onto the grounds. Surprise widened their eyes, hushed their voices. This was no backyard dinner. When my parents pulled up, my mother's first words slipped out like a gasp. "What is this?" I watched from the top of the steps, my dress a stream of silk, that caught the evening light. I didn't rush to answer. I let her confusion hang in the air, let my father's brow tighten as he tried to calculate. Inside, the estate had been transformed. Candles flickered on every mantel. Tables were set with linen so soft it felt like a secret, each place marked with calligraphy. The string quartet played in the corner, notes of a familiar melody twisted into something elegant and strange. Guests whispered to each other, stunned, but my parents said nothing. The ceremony was held in the garden. Rows of chairs faced an arch wrapped in deep burgundy dahlias and ivory roses, the flowers heavy with meaning. As I walked down the aisle, I didn't look at my mother or my father. I looked only at Daniel, standing steady, his eyes fixed on me like I was the only truth he'd ever believed. Vows were exchanged in the hush of dusk, words soft enough that only the closest could hear. I promised love not in grand gestures, but in steady truths, in the same quiet strength that had carried me here. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause felt different than at Ethan's wedding. Smaller, yes, but sharper, more intimate. It wasn't approval I heard, it was recognition. Then came dinner. Plates arrived one by one, each a small work of art. Conversation softened as guests tasted, sipped, leaned into the glow of the evening. My parents sat stiff, silent, watching. My brother fidgeted in his chair, his wife's smile tight at the edges. I had expected envy. What I hadn't expected was the silence, the very silence I had promised Daniel. My parents' words, their dismissals, their judgments, they had no place here. The space I had created left them with nothing to say. When the music swelled and the quartet shifted into a song everyone recognized but couldn't name, an old rock ballad reimagined with strings, I caught my mother's eyes. She blinked, looked away, her fork clattering against her plate. Then came the toast. I stood, glass in hand, the silk of my dress whispering against the floor. Guests turned to me, waiting for the bride to gush gratitude. But gratitude was not what I carried. I want to thank everyone here tonight, I began, voice calm, steady. Not for the gifts or the help, because this night wasn't built on that. This night was built on something else, on love that doesn't measure itself in money, on partnerships that grow stronger not from what's given, but from what's chosen. A ripple of murmurs crossed the room. My father shifted in his chair, my mother's lips pressed into a line. I continued. When Daniel and I began planning this wedding, we were told to keep it simple, to make it small, to be modest. We nodded, we smiled, and then we built this instead. Because love to us is not about shrinking, it's about expanding. I lifted my glass higher. So tonight isn't about proving anyone wrong. Tonight is about showing what love looks like when it refuses to be diminished. The room held its breath. My parents sat frozen. Ethan stared at me with something between confusion and resentment. And then Daniel raised his glass, and the room followed. Glasses clinked. Guests cheered softly. The moment settled like dust after a storm. After the toast, I didn't return to my parents' table. I danced, I laughed. I walked through the estate like it had been waiting for me all along. My parents never approached me, not once. They stayed seated, watching, as if unsure whether they were guests or intruders. And that was the sweetest part of all, because for once, they weren't in control. For once, they weren't the architects. For once, they were simply witnesses. By the end of the night, as the last notes of music faded and the candles burned low, I stepped outside into the garden. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of roses. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. Behind me, the estate glowed like a promise fulfilled. Inside, my parents sat silent in the ruins of their assumptions. And I knew the surprise wasn't just the wedding. The surprise was me. The silence the night left behind was louder than any speech I could have given. My parents didn't storm out. They didn't protest. They didn't even congratulate me in the way most parents would. Instead, they sat there as the weight of everything they'd dismissed settled on their shoulders. For once, there were no instructions, no advice, no reminders that Ethan had done it first or done it better. Only silence. And that silence was my victory. Ethan avoided my eyes for most of the evening, his wife's smile strained, brittle. He was used to being the center, the one who drew the spotlight without effort. But that night, the light had shifted. He could feel it. Everyone could. And for the first time in his life, he had no clever remark to reclaim it. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to tell them how deeply their favoritism had cut me. The proof was all around them, in the elegance of the room, the warmth of my friends, the joy that thrummed through the walls without their funding or control. When I lifted my glass one last time, I didn't address my parents. I didn't even look their way. I turned to Daniel. To us, I said softly, to building something stronger than expectations, to building a life no one else can diminish. Glasses rose around the room. My parents didn't move, and I didn't care. Because the truth was, I hadn't built this night for them. I had built it for me, for the girl who had once believed she wasn't worth a fraction of what her brother was given, for the woman who had finally stepped into her own power. The reversal wasn't in humiliating them, it was in showing them, quietly, elegantly, that I didn't need them at all. And that was a kind of revenge no amount of money could ever buy. When the last guest drifted away and the lanterns flickered low, I walked hand in hand with Daniel through the garden. The estate stood behind us like a cathedral, glowing in the night, every window a testament to what we had built. I thought of the years I had spent waiting for approval, for recognition, for my parents' version of fairness. I thought of the way I had convinced myself that love was measured in what others gave me. And then I thought of tonight. I hadn't just married Daniel, I had married freedom. My parents' silence lingered, but it no longer had teeth. Their absence in my joy no longer cut, it clarified. I didn't need their money, their blessing, or their applause. That night, I closed the door on the daughter they thought I was, the quiet one, the reasonable one, the afterthought. In her place stood a woman who had written her own story, staged her own reveal, and walked away untouchable. The surprise hadn't been the wedding. The surprise had been me all along. They thought I'd stay quiet. Instead, I showed them I didn't need them at all. If you've ever been underestimated, hit that subscribe button. More stories like this are coming.